I really appreciate, David. Thank you for that kind of introduction. It was just as I wrote it. When I was appointed the 20th clerk of the Privy Council in 2006, and the first Atlantic Canadian to ever do it, I got a note from a cousin here in Cape Breton, and the note kind of said, "Dear Kevin, we're all very proud of you, but we're a little bit worried as well because in the announcement you keep referring to yourself as the clerk of the Privy Council, and everybody in Cape Breton knows there's thousands of clerks in Ottawa. But we do wish you well." It's always a challenge to talk to different kind of groups. Now, some may have heard the story, but one of my favorite stories about the first time I ended up speaking in front of a group was in 1999 when Canada was opening the Sudbury Neutrino Observatory, which is our first giant science project that we've invested a lot in as a country to find the neutrino. And Professor Stephen Hawking was coming over to open the event, which for those of you who know Professor Hawking, this was to test one of his great theories. And the Prime Minister Chrétien was due to introduce Professor Hawking. There were 2 or 3 Nobel Prize winners who were going to speak before, and it was being telecast live in Europe and Canada. It was a big deal. And so being the good public servant, I was sent out early just to make sure the chairs were kind of in the right place and the screens were kind of up and really not to have much of a role. So this went on for a little while. We were getting closer to start time, and a note came and said, Prime Minister can't make it. There's a vote in the House tonight, but don't worry. Now, there are 3 words that every public servant is trained to actually react to this. You don't have to worry. They're kind of devastatingly nervous. So, but they said a minister is going to come and kind of replace the Prime Minister. At this point, I started to look at the introductory remarks, which were about 20 minutes long and were truly vacuous. To introduce one of the great kind of scientists of the world. So anyway, we got closer and closer. I was flipping through these remarks, and suddenly we had to get up on stage because we were going to go live, and still no minister. And just we're sitting up, and I'm filling the seat, and a little note gets passed over. The minister's plane can't land. It's you. So I'm now starting to look seriously at this absolutely dreadful speech that turned out I'd signed it off. And I was physically putting the pages under my chair because I couldn't think any human being could possibly say something so meaningless. Anyway, it's the first Nobel Prize winner gets up to say a few words. He's amazing. Sits down. The second one gets up. He's even more impressive. He sits down. The third one gets up. He's amazing. And it's my turn. And I stumble to the mic. In about 30 seconds, barely get out kind of how thrilled we were to have Professor Hawking. And I stumble back to my chair, absolutely mortified. I sit down, and the Nobel Prize winner on my left pats me on the knee and says quite loudly, "Well done." And I turned to him and said, "Well done?" I said, "Absolutely nothing." He said, "Nobody expected you to say anything, but nobody thought you'd be brief." And in that, I learned expectations management is a really important part of public speaking and public policy, actually. I'll just tell you one other story, and then I'll go to my thing. I remember, these are the learning by example stories. I was at cabinet one time, and it was an early, a new cabinet kind of sworn in, and Prime Minister Chrétien was there, and there was an issue. We were having a broad discussion about issues. And the Prime Minister was sitting there, and ministers were putting their hand up to speak, and after they finished, you saw that the Prime Minister was writing down something, and you can sort of see around everybody thinking, wow, he's keeping a list of who's speaking. So hands went up to speak, speeches got longer and longer. This goes on for about 20 minutes, and finally Mr. Chrétien says, just for clarity, I'm keeping a list of those who didn't need to speak. Hopefully you won't think I'm one of those at the end of it. So what I want to talk about today, if it's okay, is, in fact, if it isn't okay, it's what you're going to get as well. But we're going to miss the boat if we cling to the status quo. My premise is the following. We're going through a period of profound change. Not just in Cape Breton, not just in Nova Scotia, not just in Canada, North America. It's a global change. I think it's one of the great pivot points that we've gone through in the post-war period, frankly. And the question for us is, do we really believe that? And if we do, how are we going to respond? Or, in our heart of hearts, do we hope this is just a passing kind of period of time and we're going to go back to the world we knew? And that's a fundamental decision to make. It's a fundamental decision for governments to make. It's a fundamental decision for business leaders to make. It's a fundamental decision actually for university, but most importantly, it's a key issue for us as individuals. So I'm going to argue today for you that this is a fundamental turning point. The world is changing profoundly, and if we're going to thrive, we're going to even continue to do as well, then we're going to have to do the same. So if I can go through my first little message is that we have to disrupt the status quo to thrive. And the problem is, in changing times, there's a tendency to embrace the status quo. If you can see the screen, God bless you. If you can't, I'll tell you what it says. The message one is, we have to disrupt the status quo if we're going to survive. And you think about it, societies today are changing. It's not just the economy, it's not just the emerging things. We're changing fundamentally in our approach to politics, power, communications, and how we do all these things. And it's true here in Canada, it's true around the world. And what it does is it creates an imperative for change. If we don't change, we're not going to do so well. And I'm going to just flag 6 elements of the world that are changing for you. And if you can look at the top, and I'll go around clockwise, the first is the decline in trust. The Pew Institute in the United States surveys kind of trust indices of leadership. Not just government leadership, but private sector leadership of anything. They've been doing it for about kind of 35, 40 years. Trust levels of leadership now are the lowest they've ever been. It's true in the United States, true in the United Kingdom, true in Canada, but not as pervasive and as exceptional as it in others. Think what that means. When I was a public servant 15, 20 years back, if you came out with a new policy, there was a presumption of trust. Yes, that is the policy. It's based on fundamental things. We'll actually trust the government with that policy until it's disproved. Same thing if a company comes out with a product, same thing. You don't get that at all today. Today, the presumption is maybe at best. And that's a very different world. It's less efficient to do public policy in that sort of world. And so there are costs to societies with low trust. Society that gets the highest trust ratings today, Singapore. Number 2, Hong Kong. So again, it's not in the Western economies where you get high trust. It's actually in a number of the emerging economies you get high trust. And there is an element, if you go back, trust levels were much higher in Western economies 34 years back than they were in emerging, and it's been a complete flip. And I don't think it's totally uncorrelated with the changing economic behavior as well. So first is trust matters, and trust is not where it should be in Western economies, and that's true here in Canada as well. On the top right, and this is obviously not true for most of this room, is that we have a demographic challenge in Canada. Outside of this room, actually people are aging. And we've been doing it individually for a long period of time, Joe Shannon accepted, but we're actually now doing it collectively. And Canada is aging very quickly. This year, to give you an example, this year we have a smaller proportion of the Canadian population working than we had last year. Population's still growing. There are more Canadians today than there were kind of last year, but fewer of them are working. So for you to get the same goods and services, a smaller proportion of Canadians actually have to work more productively to do it. And that's going to grow next year and the year after and the year after. And what it means is we have to become more productive, and we actually have to have more immigration to kind of deal with it. And for Atlantic Canada, the worst demographics in the country are here in Atlantic Canada, unfortunately. So we've got a demographic challenge, and it's a fact. Which country in the world has the biggest demographic dividend? Guess? India. 625 million people under the age of 30. Which country has the biggest looming demographic problem? It's actually China. Because a one-child policy so China will have a bigger demographic problem than any other country in 15 years when the current workforce starts to reach retirement age. So again, you look at India and China, both doing extraordinarily well, the 2 largest countries in the world by population, but they have fundamentally different demographics, which is interesting again as you go ahead. Third issue is the global financial crisis. It has been an extraordinary impact around it. But again, think of the difference, all right? If you go back to the 70s, to the 80s, to the 90s, when we had a global financial crisis, which parts of the world were most impacted? It was the emerging world, right? It wasn't the Western world, it was the emerging world. And which parts of the world had the worst fiscal outcomes because of it? The emerging world. This time around, China, India, Brazil, Mexico, Their banking systems were as sound as Canada. Which ones cratered? The United States, the United Kingdom, France now, parts of kind of Europe. And again, fiscal problems. Are they in China and India today? No, they're not. They're in the United States. They're in the UK. So this is not the world that we're kind of used to and have built a lot of our policies on. The bottom of it talks about the new competitiveness. Think about it today. If you sell a standardized product, right? So you've been proud and you've been making that same widget now for 4 or 5 years, and gosh darn it, it's a good widget. You're going to go out of business because you've had it standardized so long that there's going to be somebody around the world that actually can produce that at a lower cost and a higher scale than you can, right? And that's what's happening to lots of Canadian kind of business. How do you win in that world? You produce unstandardized products. You innovate. You change the service, you change the good at a faster pace. And so what Canada has to do is we have to decide whether we're in the standardized kind of product mode of competitiveness or whether we're in an innovation-driven competitiveness. And it's not clear where we are today, and it's a challenge, and I'll come back to it. The second to last, if you go up the left-hand side, is the information revolution. And again, think where that change has come. You know, the internet, mid-90s, right? Kind of cell phone, the last 10 years. Think of where we are today. We're moving into hyperconnectivity, where you have 25% of all mobile, all kind of text messages in the United States are on mobile. And big data and analytic data have moved Walmart into the largest, other than government, the largest telecommunications firm in the world, if you will. Because actually what Walmart is good at isn't necessarily sticking boxes of kind of household goods on a shelf. Anybody can do that. What Walmart can do is the minute you take that kind of whatever you want to purchase through the checkout, they assemble that information from every single store around the world, analyze kind of who you are, your gender, your age, your buying patterns, and readjust what they're going to buying and shipping and selling. And they do that instantaneously. And that's what you're competing against if you're a small Canadian company selling into the world, right? So again, a very different world. Think of Syria. Horrible civil war going on in Syria. The Syrian first response was to ban foreign journalists. Why? Because that's the traditional model. If there aren't journalists there, how can they possibly report on it? Why do you see Syria every night on TV? Because anybody with a smartphone is now a journalist. So you've got 60,000 journalists in Syria, and the world knows exactly what's happening. That's the information revolution. How's that changing business? How's it changing education? I was at Davos this year, and one of the sessions was on the MOOCs, the massive online kind of courses. And we had the president of Harvard, the president of MIT, the president of Oxford, Cambridge, and they were debating putting their courses online and what it meant. And so it was, Tom Friedman from the New York Times was moderating. It was a fascinating discussion. The end of this discussion, where they were going back and forth and what it meant for their institution, there was an open chair on the podium, and they invited a young girl, she was 11 years old, from Pakistan, from Lahore, Nadia, to come up. Sat down, Tom introduced her, asked her if she'd taken an online course, and she said yes. The audience all thought, well, that's great. And they asked, where was the course, who was it given by? And she said, Stanford. And they said, what was it? And she said it was a graduate course in astrophysics. And they asked, well, how did you do? And she said, I came first. And she said, what did Stanford say? And they asked me what graduate school I was in Pakistan, and I replied I was starting middle school next year. And so what does that mean for education in that kind of world? You know, for the Nadias, it's fantastic because it means that we will be able to reach out to global talent. But what does it mean for us in an institutional sense? Not clear. And the last is pervasive globalization, which is kind of what links all this together. Think about it. The emerging Asia today is going to be 50% of global GDP by the end of this decade. In the 1950s, it was in the single digits. All right? If you go back to 1700, it was 50% of global GDP. What's fascinating about it is this isn't the emergence of Asia, it's the re-emergence of Asia. But whereas it took 2,000 years for kind of the world's economic center of gravity to move to the West. It's only taking 75 years for it to move back to Asia. And the issue is, do we have our minds around what that pace and scale of change and how we're ready for it and how we're going to build our business communities here in Cape Breton for it? So that's message one, the world is changing. Message two is that in this world, and follows from it, the new global reality is a two-speed world. And the problem is we're in the slow lane. The fast lane are the emerging economies, and they're growing 5 to 8%. It's Indonesia, it's Vietnam, it's China, it's India, you name the list. The slow lane is everybody that we trade with. The United States, the United Kingdom, kind of Europe. And so all the markets that were so important to our success for so long are now actually an anchor as against a kind of rocket kind of boosting us. And our challenge is, for Canada, for Atlantic Canada, for Cape Breton, is if you want to grow faster than the neighborhood, then you've got to trade with a faster growing neighborhood. And so if we continue to trade with the United Kingdom and the US, we're going to grow about 2%. If you take the time to change to China and elsewhere, we have the chance of growing at 4 or 5%. And that's the imperative for actually structurally changing. We've got to move our investment and our business to the fast lane. And those of you can see the graph that's kind of up, it just gives the numbers, but graphically, I think shows that the bottom line are the advanced economies, the middle line are the emerging economies, and the top line are the emerging Asia economies. 2 points from this graph. One is the rise of the emerging economies didn't happen kind of post-financial crisis. It was there before, we just didn't notice it. And Asia didn't even have a financial crisis, and Asia didn't have a recession. So again, we have a tendency to look out from our perspective on the world, and we see it very differently than Asia sees our part of the world today. And so again, I think unless we've got much better linkages from our business community elsewhere there, we're going to have some challenges. Now, next message is, in this world, you can't have globalized markets without having globalized risks. And the World Economic Forum now has what's called a global risk map. And these are for kind of risks that affect us all. So think about it. You know, a month or two back, Cyprus lost a couple of banks, right? Toronto Stock Exchange fell. The New York Stock Exchange fell. This is over a Cyprus bank that's smaller than most credit unions in Canada. And it caused global financial markets to tremble. That actually wouldn't have happened 10 or 15 years back. That's a hyper-connected world, right? So the yin and the yang is the opportunity of hyper-connected is the ability to sell all the things we produce here around the world. So our market is no longer Nova Scotia and the Northeast US, it's the world, but the downside are the risks. And it's interesting, the World Economic Forum on the your risk is my risk argues now that there aren't such things as national risks. It's largely global risks that companies should be thinking about. That the thing that sideswipes you is not what you know. You should be fired if you don't know that. It's actually what you don't know and what you don't anticipate. And those are often coming from other places. Your competitor is not going to be the person next door. You're going to know what she or he is doing. Your competitor is going to come from elsewhere around the world. And if you look at the top 5 risks, so this is a global panel, I happen to be one of the members of it, is looking at the top 5 global risks for business as well as government. Number 1 is actually income inequality. That's actually a fascinating insight by business people, not just policy folks. That the threat to stability, economic stability in Mexico, the biggest is income inequality. It's actually not government policies, it's not kind of criminal gangs and other things, it's income inequality. So it's interesting. This is where you start to get, and this is where I think the programs that we teach at CBU are important, is in this world, it's not clear where economics ends and social policy begins. In fact, this argues that they're actually on a continuum. And if you don't get the social policy right, you won't get the economy right long term. And if you don't get the economy right, you won't get the social policy right. Number 2 is unsustainable fiscal balances. That's something that we know in the United States. It's also something we know at times in this province. Give me a factoid for the United States. Gross debt in the United States, federal debt this year, is slightly over 100% of GDP. Last time was 1945 to pay for the Second World War. And there's no chance that the United States is going to grow over the next 10 years to essentially kind of grow down that debt the way they did before. So we are into uncharted territory which again is an argument for diversification. Number 3 is climate change. Number 4 is interesting. It's water. So this is a global thing. In China, if you talk to the leaders in both business and government in China, they actually will rank water as 1, 2, or 3 of the constraints, because you can't run the economy without water, and you can't run the industrial kind of aspects of it without water, and that's increasingly the constraint. And interestingly, Canada not only has lots of water, but more importantly, we have water technologies, and we know how to deal with water, and we've got it around. So again, you talk about where could Canada create expertise and technical skill that can be global. Here's a great example. One of the top 5 risks in the world, and actually how are we exploiting our knowledge of it for it. And the last is the demographics of aging that we went through. Okay, so message 4, if you take those 3, I come back to innovation. And I think innovation's got to be for Canada, but also for Cape Breton as well. It's got to be what drives our competitors. We got to be able to produce new goods and services, take them to new markets with new brands year in and year out. And that's easy to say, but it's really hard to do it. And unless we do that, we're going to have challenges. Let me give you 3 graphs here that are going to come up, and I'll describe them for you. Top left-hand side shows Canadian business productivity growth since 1947. And the graph is going down. In other words, in every subsequent kind of successive decade, our productivity growth has gotten worse. Decade after decade after decade. Now you can ask, how in the heck did we survive? Well, part of it is we had a 65-cent dollar, and we essentially subsidized bad productivity performance. If you look on the bottom left, what the graph is, it takes the level of business productivity in Canada, so the level, so all the businesses in Canada combined, even Joe's, and actually compares them to the business sector in the United States. And the ratio is 72%. In other words, our business sector has only 72% of US productivity levels. Now, we did fine for a period of time when the exchange rate was under 72%, 72 cents, but we're not doing so well today. Indeed, what we did is we underinvested in productivity enhancing things because of that exchange rate. And on the right-hand side gives you business spending on research and development. Now, if you take my model, that to be successful, we've got to be more innovation driven. We've got to have companies that every year can change their product mix, just like Apple changes the iPod every 6-7 months. We've got to be able to do that across all our range. You've got to spend on R&D. If you look at the list on the right-hand side, which you can't see, but trust me, even with the trust issue that we have, what it says is Canada's 22nd in the OECD. We're below Slovenia, Slovakia, Iceland, Ireland, and the other R&D powerhouses of the world. It's pathetic, frankly. How are we going to win in innovation if we don't spend on innovation? And so it's a real challenge for us. And actually, Atlantic Canada is well below the Canadian average as well. So we've got a little bit of a challenge on the innovation side. Message 5 basically takes you through the notion of why does productivity matter? And productivity, again, isn't just a thing that drives corporate profit. It's actually the thing that drives wages. You cannot have higher wages unless you have higher productivity. And so how do we generate that in an economy? How do we move it through? And it's really quite simple, frankly. If you can see the graph, what it tells you is on the left-hand side is productivity per worker, right? And you want that as high as you could possibly have. There are only 3 things that can generate that. On the far right is you can work more hours. Now, I don't think there are a lot of Canadians, and Atlantic Canadians, maybe Cape Bretoners, who actually want to be more productive by working more hours. But in the last 10 years, that's the only way we've increased productivity in Canada. The only way. We work harder today than we did 10 years back, and that's the consequence. So rather than actually a productivity focus forcing you to work harder, actually poor productivity has had the result of making us work harder because the other 2 parts are the key part. If you increase the value of what you produce, per hour, your productivity goes up. So why does Apple produce a new iPad every 6 months? To actually charge a premium price again. And the value per worker, per hour, if he or she was producing iPod 1, then the price is going to go down and down and down because there's a competitor somewhere to lower price. But if you're producing iPod 5, and then 6, and then 7, the wages go up, the price goes up, the profits go up. And you've got to continually be able to do that. And think about it. Apple's price peaked at about $600 a share in February, March, and then fell to under 400. Do you know why it fell under 400? There was no bad earnings report. There was no bad sales report. They missed an innovation cycle. They didn't turn out a new iPad in the 6-month period. And what the markets had done is they had actually discounted into the price that innovation cycle of a new product at a superior price every kind of 6 months. So it actually, markets do value innovation. And we've got to be doing much more of the value added part. Now, what does that mean in Cape Breton? How do you get this? How do we actually create an innovation kind of driven economy here? And it doesn't have to be high tech. You can have as much, I would argue there's as much innovation potential in agriculture, in kind of fishing and forestry as there is in high tech. And there's actually less competition. So let me just go through a couple of elements if I can. If you look through the Nordic countries, if you look through the United States, if you look through Silicon Valley, what are the 6 factors that come up all the time in terms of successful? And this isn't just high tech. This is any sector. One is markets. Are there opportunities? And where are the opportunities today? They're not in Boston. They're not in Toronto and Montreal. They're in Beijing. They're in Sao Paulo. They're in Indonesia and other places. And why? Because we have a tendency in Canada to think that all China does is buy our natural resources. But what is the growth of China doing? It's producing a middle class of 300 or 400 million people. In Asia, the middle class is now 600 to 900 million. And what do they want to buy? They want to buy good food, much better food. They want better housing. They want health care. They want education. They want financial service. Everything that we produce for middle class markets, they want to buy. The fastest growing tourist segment in the world today are Chinese tourists, and they actually spend more per day abroad than an American tourist does. Canada is 14th as a destination. Atlantic Canada doesn't get any. So again, premium market, premium price, huge growth, but we're not targeting it. We're not even thinking about it and kind of developing what it would take to do it. Second is competitive intensity. What this says is, if you're the only person around who's doing something, that's pretty lonely. There are exceptional entrepreneurs, but most folks do better if there's a bit of a crowd. And so if you have 10 companies thinking about selling forestry or fishing to Brazil, it's a heck of a lot easier to do it. You find commonalities of scale, language, support services, and what have you. So strangely enough, what you really want when you're not competing down the street but around the world is you want to have a bunch of folks like you in the region to compete out. In other words, we have to change our mentality is, if we don't sell something, Larry down the street sells it. And it's a zero-sum game. And that's kind of true in our traditional markets. But that makes no sense whatsoever in a global economy. There is so much potential for all Canadian firms. In fact, the brand that you want to go on is the Canadian brand. And that's kind of the cluster strategy you need. The corporate culture, though, is really important. Do we have a culture that actually wants to embed innovation in it? And innovation has to be managed for, incented, and structured. So again, if we want to create that in kind of Cape Breton, what's it going to take? What's our variant of it? And I'll come back to it in a sec. Now, the next graph sort of looks and says, can we possibly win in this world? It just sounds innovation, productivity, globalization, kind of countries all around. How do we do it? And this is a slide that, again, will be available to you afterwards. But what I asked was, what are the various measures of success today? And I've picked out a couple. Let me give them to you. The Global Competitiveness Index, the Innovation Index, both come from the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum's soundness of financial systems, net debt to GDP, tertiary education, from the OECD, Global Opportunity Index, FDI, and income per capita. And these are all measures of success in the new economy. And what I've picked up here is, you'll see it as the top 5 countries for each of these, and then Canada and the United States. And I'm not expecting you to see, and it'll go through it. The point I want you to take away is, if you go for Global Competitiveness Index, number 1, Switzerland. Number 2, Singapore. Number 3, Finland. Number 4, Sweden. Number 5, Netherlands. There's not a single large country in that list, right? Go to the innovation capacity list. Number 1, Switzerland. Number 2, Japan. 3, Finland. 4 Netherlands, 5 Sweden. They're not that different than us. Their social safety nets are similar, their education systems are similar, the public-private mix is similar to us. My point is, if you look at the highly successful countries around, they're not the biggest, they're the cleverest. And that's where actually this ability to create common purpose between business, academe, and government, I think really pays off. And you can just see right across the list here, if you go net debt to GDP, lowest in the world is actually Norway. Number 2 is Finland. Number 3 is Sweden. Number 4 is Denmark. Number 5 is Australia. We like to brag about Canada, but we're number 10. If you go to the tertiary education, Canada is very well, but that's backward looking. If you look to the PISA scores for kind of grades, I think it's 3, 6, and 9. The winner, Shanghai. Number 2, Singapore. Number 3, Hong Kong. Number 4, Korea. If you look at the Global Opportunity Index, Hong Kong. My point being here is that when you look at what it takes to succeed, it typically is innovation, a huge focus on innovation, an enormous focus on talent, an enormous focus on actually the community, the soft infrastructure of the community. And it also says that common purpose trumps size every time. So again, I think out of these sort of things, there's a lot that we can learn and do. Now, message 8 is, so where are kind of these new opportunities? And again, part of the problem you can see, and this is true whether we're giving this speech in Toronto or we're doing it here, is that sounds great, Kevin, but how in the heck is a company from Cape Breton, from Nova Scotia, even from Canada, going to do well in this? And this slide tries to make the point that this is not about selling natural resources. Leave that aside. This is about a new market where there are 900 million consumers in emerging economies, 100 million of them with higher per capita incomes than any middle class in North America, right? So think about agriculture and food. Food systems in India, China have been designed over 2,000 years for traditional substance. They actually can't produce what those middle classes want. Somebody was telling me the Clearwater, John Risley was telling me one time that when they first started exporting lobster to China as a high premium good, they labeled it as Clearwater, and it didn't do terribly well. And the reason they discovered was because lots of Chinese firms might call themselves Clearwater, and it's brand confusion. They relabeled themselves as Canadian lobster, and they sell at 8 to 10 times what we pay here. In other words, the brand is really important, and the brand of Canada is very high. In other words, you don't have to create a brand for your Cape Breton company. The brand is Canada. You just have to align with that Canadian brand in the foreign markets. It makes it easier. Take education. 1 billion Asian youths are going to be seeking education this year. There's no way the infrastructure in Asia can educate them. This is what we're already trying to do here at CBU. I was in Qatar kind of earlier this spring. The College of the North Atlantic has 8,000 students and 500 teachers from Atlantic Canada teaching in Qatar. That's an export service. How much further? So you can either go out or you can have the students come in. Both cases, that's actually knowledge exporting in this world we're in. Infrastructure, energy, healthcare is another one which I think has enormous Canadian potential. China, there isn't a public healthcare system. There's a private public system. There's not a public one. Water again. So my point is, think through what we've done. For kind of 50 years, we basically produced things for middle-class Canadians and middle-class northeastern U.S. There is a huge middle-class market out there, and the Canada brand is valuable. So I was involved in Forefront Atlantic, which was a business-led initiative here in Nova Scotia and across the region, to ask basically over 3 conferences, basically 3 questions. The first is, why should we change? And we brought in a lot of experts from outside the region to talk about this changing world. And I think there was broad-based consensus that we have to change. Second conference a year back was, what does it take? And that's a good question as well, because it's one thing to know you have to change, another thing to know what you have to do to change. This year's conference we just finished, and I would encourage you to go on the Forefront Atlantic website, was, and how do we do it? And what's it going to take? And you can see on this graph here, what it shows you is we came down with 4 things that we've got to focus on going global. Do you know that fewer than 5% of businesses in Atlantic Canada sell a single good or service outside of Canada? 5%. There's no way we're going to have a vibrant economy if we're not selling into vibrant markets. 5%. Just double that number, and it has a huge impact. Second is talent. How do we prepare for these things? Innovation and productivity and capital. Take talent. This is one that gives you an example. Say we want to tap into the Chinese upscale tourism market, right? If you go to any hotel in downtown Vancouver and you check in, Mandarin language services are available. You go into any hotel, I would argue in Atlantic Canada, and there will be absolutely zero Mandarin language services. How many unilingual Mandarin speakers do you think are going to come to a region that doesn't offer the services? How many are potentially willing to come here if we package language with what they really want to see is they actually want wilderness without a lot of people around, because where they come from, there are a lot of people around and not a lot of... So we offer exactly what they want, but we've got to offer it in a way that they want it. And that's our opportunity, and there's lots of other ones there. The next one went through a little bit kind of on the how to, and I'll just leave this with you to go through. But let me kind of flag 4 issues that we're looking at. One is we have to increase immigration into Atlantic Canada. Right now, Nova Scotia gets 1/2 of the national rate of immigration. So we have the oldest demographics in the country and the second worst immigration in the country. They don't compute, frankly. Doesn't matter what we do in the local economy, pushing ahead 10 or 15 years, if we don't increase the rate of labor force growth, we're not going to prosper. And so I would argue without a focus on immigration as part of the whole kind of approach, we're in trouble. And that's where the university can play such a role, because it can be the first time you actually touch a culture and a society elsewhere around. And from that initial relationship can come a lot of things. On the going global, I think we have to focus on 2 or 3 sectors and 2 or 3 geographies and just reach critical mass. And I think it's up to the business community working with government to decide what they are. But we're too small to choose 180 countries and 23 sectors. So what are they? Ontario is going to choose 5 geographies and 5 sectors. What about us here? But unless we do that, you're not going to create the knowledge and the scale that's going to allow small and medium-sized businesses in Cape Breton to get there, frankly. Innovation and productivity, one of the things we're focusing on is, I chair the Board of Governors of Waterloo, and an interesting mental experiment that people do is, if you go back 40 years and compare Waterloo to Halifax, which of the 2 would you have forecast would have thrived the most? And actually, you probably would have said Halifax, and you would have been wrong. And a lot of it is driven by the university. A lot of it's driven by the incredible interaction between the business community and the university. We have something called Communitech, which is an incubator in Waterloo, and it's jointly owned by the business community and the university. It started in 2009. It actually has created 843 startup firms that employ more than 5,000 people and have raised over $500 million in capital. We've got to do the same thing here. What we have to do is grow new firms, start firms. That's the key to how we kind of do it. And they don't have to be in IT. They have to be in fisheries, water, oceans management, you name it, the stuff that we have been working on, but we've got to turn it into export stuff. The next, I'll just go through this one quickly. The next is the brand issue. And this is the second to last, so just give me a second on this. Think about in this world, right? So you're a Cape Breton company, and you've really kind of got the bug about going global. So you want to get off a plane, you're in Shanghai, and you're going to sell your services. That's a pretty tough sell, frankly. You're all by yourself. You're not the first person that's discovered China. There are probably a few hundreds of thousands of companies before you. And what do? By definition, you're not General Electric. We don't have huge iconic companies in Canada, right? What we have is we have a really good country brand. And so the brand matters. It's what actually gets you through the door. If you come from Canada, quality, kind of a sense of institutional security, a sense that we worry about our products, those things matter, right? They matter to universities. It attracts staff and attracts students. It matters to companies because it allows you to attract capital or sell your goods and services. It matters to the country because it attracts foreign direct investment. If you look at then how we're perceived, if you look at the graph, you can see on the right-hand side is every single survey we do, Canada comes up. Our only international brand is we're nice. There is no other brand. And the terrible thing is Canadians laugh, but actually they're pretty happy about that. They think that's good, okay? and it's not bad, but you try and sell something because you're nice, right? You try and get Nadia from Pakistan to come to Cape Breton University because David's nice, it's not going to work. She's going to come because it's a great environment, it's a great community, they're great teachers, and it's actually going to make her a better person, right? But if you go down the left-hand side about our brand potential, think about it. One of the best macroeconomic policies in the world, wonderful communities, institutions and kind of the rule of law, great natural resources, and great talent. So if you go through the list of what we are as a country and we are as a community here, it's exactly what the world wants to partner with. But the brand that we're leaving with the world, and it's our fault, not the world's, is that we're nice. So part of our challenge is how do we make it nice plus? It's not a bad beginning, but it's not a commercial beginning, and we've got to do a little bit more. But for Cape Breton, it's kind of aligning with that Canada brand that really matters. So my last is, I'm actually an optimist on this. I think Atlantic Canada, Cape Breton have enormous potential in this world. My only point is it's potential, it's not entitlement. And don't confuse the two. The potential, I think, is more now than there's been in the last 20 or 30 years because the markets aren't in the middle of the continent, which is a geographic disadvantage to us. They're around the world. We're as closer than Ontario or Chicago or other markets to it. So this changing world actually is changing back to our advantage, but it's only an advantage. It's not a guarantee unless we do. And I think we've got to do a couple things. One is we have to be really clear about what our ambitions are. What do we want to be? And are we going to do what it's going to take to realize those ambitions? And we've got to be clear about our collective interests. You know, it's the lonely entrepreneur works in a closed local economy. It takes a lot more of collective work when you're in a broader one. And so I'll leave you with 4 thoughts. First, in this world, leadership really matters. At Davos this year, the CEO of Cisco is a pretty impressive company, he had a great line which was, quote, "The worst strategic move you can make in uncertain times is stand still." And the chairman of Samsung, who was on the same panel, piped up and said, "What I tell every one of my managers is, in times like this, you change everything but your wife and kids." Now, are we thinking that dramatically? Because Samsung does it every 6 months, right? That's what it means to change. Second is mindset matters. And I actually kind of like the quote from George Bernard Shaw, which is to disrupt the status quo. And the quote is that you see things and you say, why? In other words, the status quoers. But I dream things that never were, and I say, why not? And I think in Cape Breton, we've got to ask why not more often. I think we stop with the why. We actually see the reasons why we shouldn't change, why it's complicated to change, why China's far away, why Brazil has a different language. We don't go to the why not. Why not have a big presence there? Why not export around? Why not teach different languages? Why not have Chinese tourism here as a key part of our economy? Third is innovation and productivity. If we're going to win in this world, it can't be by replicating things that others do. If we really believe in ourselves, if we think we've got a great culture here, good business people, well-educated population, then you have to believe that we can produce goods that we define that are sellable. We're never going to win in this world if we're followers, only if we're leaders. And the last one is urgency. This analysis is not particularly unique. Anybody looking at this global economy will come to the same. So in essence, direction and policy and corporate strategy is great, but execution is really key. And in this world, speed is going to win. And I think the more that we can come to common purpose about the need for change, the advantages for change, what change means for our kids, what we want is that there is a greater opportunity over the next 10 or 15 years for our best and our brightest and our most ambitious to actually realize their dreams here in Cape Breton rather than feel they have to go somewhere else. Thank you very much.